What did people eat in the Middle Ages to survive the cold? What they ate to survive shocks many historians. And now I will reveal all the main secrets. What is a medieval winter like? Most likely your imagination paints a picture of snow-covered roofs, cozy smoke from chimneys, and perhaps a merry feast by the fireplace. Survival during these months was a slow, daily battle, not against an enemy, but against the calendar. Diet became a weapon against the cold, and every meal was a carefully calculated move in this game. It was not about delicacies, but about calories. Not about taste, but about the ability to hold out until the first green shoots of spring. Food was fuel in the truest sense of the word, and everything depended on its supply. Watch the video to the end, and you'll find out what simple and ubiquitous drink was actually the key to survival and saved people from disease much more effectively than any food. What if I told you that everything you believed about medieval feasts was untrue? Glamorous images of feasts with swans and boar heads were a reality for only a tiny percentage of the population, and even then only on special occasions. For everyone else, especially in winter, food was primarily a test of endurance. It was an era of great culinary boredom when week after week the same thing appeared on the table. The key to survival was not the art of cooking, but the art of planning. The entire warm season, from spring to autumn, was devoted to one goal: filling the pantries. Every bundle of grain gathered, every fish salted, every barrel of cabbage was an investment in the future. A miscalculation or a poor harvest meant catastrophic consequences for the entire community. The medieval year was divided into two gastronomic seasons: the season of abundance and the season of preservation. In summer and early autumn, the diet was relatively varied, including fresh vegetables, fruits, and dairy products. But as soon as the first frosts hit, this window of opportunity closed. The long reign of preserved, salted, and dried foods began. The psychological pressure of such a diet was enormous. Imagine that your breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 4 or 5 months consist of the same basic ingredients. These were mainly rye bread, thick soup made from dried beans or peas, and a small piece of salted meat or fish. Monotony was as much an enemy as the cold. The menu was determined not by desire, but by the contents of the barrel in the cellar. Taste was secondary. The main task was to obtain sufficient energy. Salt, the main preservative, soaked into the food so much that it often had to be soaked in water for a long time. This further impoverished the already bland taste of winter meals. That is why spices, even the simplest ones like mustard or horseradish, were so highly valued. They were not a sign of luxury, but a necessity, the only way to break through the wall of salty and bland taste. They allowed you to somehow deceive your taste buds and make daily meals psychologically tolerable. There was no room for whims in this system. People ate what was available and were grateful that it was available at all. Children grew up perceiving this cycle as the only one possible. The anticipation of spring was not just an anticipation of warmth, it was a passionate anticipation of fresh flavors. This monotony of the diet, however, was the secret to sustainability. A system based on conservation allowed people to survive even the harshest and longest winters. The lack of variety was the price they paid for predictability and guaranteed survival. We would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the psychological aspect of such a diet? Write about it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Want to know the secret that was the basis for the survival of entire cities and armies? This secret is simple, white, and found in every kitchen. It's salt. In a world without refrigerators, salt was not just a seasoning, but a strategic resource as important as grain or iron. The entire winter food system was built on it. The main source of protein in winter was not fresh meat, but whatever could be salted. And here it was not livestock that came first, but fish. Huge shoals of herring and cod caught in the North and Baltic Seas were the basis of prosperity for entire regions. Herring was literally the silver of the sea. The salting process was industrialized. Immediately after being caught, the fish was gutted and placed in barrels, generously sprinkled with layers of salt. The salt drew out moisture, stopping the decomposition process. In this form, the fish could be stored for months, if not years, traveling deep into the continent. The salted fish trade was one of the pillars of the medieval economy. The Hanseatic League, a powerful trading federation, built much of its wealth on its monopoly on the trade in Scandinavian cod and Baltic herring. This fish fed cities, monasteries, and armies throughout Europe. The same was true for meat. Slaughtering livestock was a seasonal event, timed for late autumn. Keeping a large herd in winter was unprofitable due to a lack of feed. Therefore, most of the animals were slaughtered, and the meat was immediately sent for salting.
Elsewhere in the village.
Pork was the ideal candidate for this. It absorbed salt well, and its fat, lard, also preserved well, and served as a valuable source of calories. Huge pieces of pork, salted meat, were placed in barrels with brine and stored in cold cellars. The taste of such products was specific. It was very salty, tough food. Before cooking, it had to be soaked for hours in several changes of water to get rid of excess salt. And even after that, the taste was far from what we are used to. Thus, the entire winter diet was based on this simple mineral. From peasants to kings, everyone depended on a reliable supply of salt. It was the invisible foundation on which medieval society depended during the cold season. Which product do you think was more important to medieval people? Salted fish or salted meat? But salt wasn't the only way. Ready to learn about preservation methods you never even knew existed? I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of medieval cuisine, which had nothing to do with salt. Although salt was rightly considered the queen of preservation, and no cellar could do without it, it was by no means the only weapon in the arsenal of medieval man. There were other, equally important ways to extend the life of crops, preserve meat or fish, and make the winter table a little more varied. These methods did not come out of nowhere. They were the result of centuries of observation, trial, and error. And what is particularly surprising is that some of them were based not on adding something, but on removing it. One of the oldest and simplest methods was drying. It was known long before the advent of writing because the principle was clear to everyone. Remove water from a product, and the bacteria in it will die. In southern Europe, this was done under the generous sun, where the heat allowed fruit and meat to dry in a matter of days. In the north, where there was less sun, the process was transferred to ovens or closer to the hearth. Literally everything that could be preserved in this way was dried, from fruit and mushrooms to herbs and even thin strips of meat. Fruit was especially popular. Apples, pears, plums, and berries were cut into thin slices, carefully laid out on wooden racks or strung on sticks. They were left in the sun or hung over the hearth, where the warm smoke helped the process. The resulting dried fruits were not just a sweet treat, they were a real storehouse of vitamins. In winter, when fresh fruit was nowhere to be found, a handful of dried apples could remind you of summer. They were added to porridge, soups, pies, or simply chewed when you wanted something sweet. Mushrooms occupied a special place. In forest regions, they were collected in huge quantities and carefully dried. Each mushroom was strung on a thread, creating whole garlands that hung from the ceiling. Where warm air and smoke helped them slowly lose moisture, the mushrooms became a concentrated source of flavor. When winter set in, it was enough to throw a handful of dried mushrooms into the pot to give even simple porridge the aroma of the forest. Mushrooms not only retained their flavor, but also served as a valuable source of protein, which was so rare during the cold season. Another ancient method of preserving food relied not on the sun, but on smoke. Smoking became almost an art form. The smoke rising from smoldering chips saturated the food with a special aroma and at the same time protected it from spoilage. Fruit tree wood or oak was used for smoking, each imparting its own flavor. Smoked hams, sausages, or fish could be stored for weeks and sometimes months without losing their quality. Smoke acted as a natural preservative, killing germs and drying the surface. For example, in Scandinavia or the coastal cities of Northern Europe, smoked fish was the basis of the winter diet. An equally important discovery of the Middle Ages was fermentation, an amazing process in which food began to preserve itself. People did not yet know the words bacteria or fermentation, but they already understood that if chopped cabbage was salted and pressed with a weight, it would begin to change after a few days. Under the action of lactic acid bacteria, the cabbage fermented, enriching itself with vitamins and acquiring a characteristic taste. Sauerkraut became almost a symbol of survival in cold lands. Barrels of sauerkraut stood in every home in Central and Eastern Europe. They were stored in basements, where the cool temperature prevented the product from spoiling. Cabbage was cheap, accessible, and, most importantly, saved people from scurvy thanks to vitamin C. In winter, when fresh vegetables were unavailable, it was cabbage that kept entire villages healthy. Cucumbers, carrots, beets, and turnips were fermented in the same way. This method required only patience and salt, but provided a reliable food supply for months. In wealthy homes, where they could afford sophistication, a method called confit was used. It was one of the most refined ways of preserving meat. Duck or goose meat was simmered in its own fat over low heat until it became tender and flavorful. The pieces of meat were then placed in clay pots and covered with the same fat. When the fat solidified, it created a thick, airtight lid that isolated the product from the air. This allowed the meat to be stored for weeks or even months, remaining juicy and flavorful. We have already discussed other amazing ways of surviving in the Middle Ages in other videos on our channel. Be sure to check them out, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new stories. What I'm about to show you was the basis of the diet of 99% of the population. If salt, meat, and fish were strategic reserves, then the daily food, the basis of the basics, was the Holy Trinity: bread, grain, and legumes. Without them, no army, no city, no village could survive. The entire medieval civilization was built on grain. Bread was not just food, but a symbol of life. However, medieval bread was very different from ours. For most people, it was heavy, dense, dark bread made from rye, barley, or a mixture of different grains. White wheat bread was a luxury available only to the highest aristocracy and wealthy townspeople. Peasants often baked bread not every day, but once a week or even less often. These loaves were huge and very dense so that they could be stored longer. Over time, they became so stale that they had to be soaked in water, milk, or more often soup before eating. Grain was not only used for bread. A large part of it was turned into porridge. Oat, barley, and millet porridge was a standard breakfast or dinner. It was a hot, high-calorie, and cheap food that provided energy for hard physical work in the cold. But the main dish on the table was soup, or potage. It was a never-ending soup that was cooked in the same pot for weeks. The pot hung over the hearth, and new ingredients were constantly added to it. A little grain, dried vegetables, a handful of beans, and if you were lucky, a bone or a small piece of salted meat for flavor. Soup was a universal dish. Stale bread was dipped into it, making it edible. It was hot, which was important for warming up. And it allowed you to use absolutely all the leftovers without throwing anything away. This soup was the culinary center of the home. Along with grain came dried legumes, peas, beans, and lentils. When dried, they could be stored almost indefinitely. They were an important source of vegetable protein, especially on days when meat was unavailable or forbidden by church fasts. Thick pea or lentil soup was as much a staple of the winter diet as salted fish. It was filling, cheap, and easy to prepare. It was this simple food that sustained millions of people throughout the long, dark months. Grain storage was a task of national importance. Every castle, monastery, and town had huge granaries. Grain had to be kept dry and protected from rodents and mold. The lives of the inhabitants depended directly on the safety of the granary. The process of turning grain into flour was also centralized. The mill, whether water or wind-powered, was the technological heart of any settlement. It belonged to the feudal lord, and the peasants were obliged to grind their grain there, giving part of their harvest for the grinding. Thus, the entire winter life revolved around grain. It was bread, porridge, and soup. It was currency and a measure of wealth. This simple, coarse, but reliable food was the foundation on which survival depended. What do you think this daily soup tasted like? But porridge alone is not enough to satisfy hunger. In the next chapter, you will learn what people drank to keep warm and survive. In the medieval world, there was a serious problem with water. In towns and villages, water sources were often polluted, leading to the spread of various ailments. Drinking raw water was risky, especially from rivers that flowed through settlements. Therefore, people sought safer alternatives. The solution was found in the fermentation process. Low-alcohol beverages such as ale, beer, and cider were much safer than water. The process of boiling the wort during brewing and the presence of alcohol in the finished product made them safe to drink. For most people, especially in Northern Europe, ale or beer was an everyday drink. Everyone drank it, men, women, and even children. It was not the strong drink we know today, but so-called small beer with a very low alcohol content, comparable to modern kvass. This drink was not only a safe substitute for water, but also an important source of calories. It was not for nothing that it was called liquid bread. Brewed from barley or other grains, it was nutritious and filling. In cold weather, a mug of warm ale with spices was a great way to warm up. The brewing process was mainly done at home. Every housewife, or, in larger households, a special brewer was responsible for the regular preparation of the drink. In cities, entire guilds were involved in this, and breweries were important centers of social life. In regions where grapes grew, wine was the main drink. Like beer, it was safer than water. However, good wine was an expensive pleasure. The poor often drank so-called piquet, a drink made from grape pomace that was refilled with water and fermented. In more northern and Celtic regions where beekeeping was widespread, mead or honey wine was prepared. This drink, fermented from honey and water, was also popular, although not as widely as beer. It was sweeter and often flavored with herbs and spices. In places where apples were abundant, such as Normandy or England, cider became the main drink. Apple juice was fermented to produce a refreshing and slightly intoxicating drink that also stored well in barrels throughout the winter. These drinks were an integral part of the diet. They not only quenched thirst and warmed the body, but also provided it with the necessary energy. A winter diet consisting of salty foods required a lot of drinking, and fermented beverages were the best solution. Thus, a barrel of ale or cider in the cellar was as important a strategic reserve as a barrel of salted meat. It ensured that the family would have not only food, but also safe drinking water for the entire long winter. It was the basis of medieval hygiene and survival. Are you ready for the shocking truth about medieval vegetables? We tend to think that the medieval diet was low in vitamins. This is partly true, but people learned to use what the earth could give them, even in the cold season. The main source of plant-based food in winter was not fresh leaves, but what was hidden underground, root vegetables. The variety of vegetables was not as diverse as it is today. Potatoes, tomatoes, and peppers were not yet known in Europe. The kings of the winter garden were turnips, parsnips, and rutabagas. These modest but hardy root vegetables were the basis of many winter dishes. Turnips were perhaps the most common vegetable. They were boiled, stewed, baked in ashes, and added to soups. They were cheap, grew well in cool climates, and, most importantly, could be stored for a very long time. Their taste was quite sharp and different from modern varieties. Parsnips were another staple of the winter table. They had a natural sweetness that intensified after the first frost. They were valued for their nutritional value and used in the same way as turnips, and sometimes as a sweetener for certain dishes. Of course, carrots were also known, but they looked different. Medieval carrot varieties were most often purple or yellow, and not as sweet as modern ones. They also stored well and added color to monotonous winter meals. Onions and garlic were absolutely indispensable. They were the spices of the poor. They were easy to grow, could be stored all winter in a dry place, and had a strong, bright flavor. Onions and garlic were the basis of the flavor of almost any soup, sauce, or meat dish. Leeks, a more hardy relative of onions, were also highly prized. They could withstand frost and were often left to overwinter in the ground, dug up as needed. They were one of the few fresh vegetables available in the middle of winter. Cabbage was another staple. Although it did not keep well fresh, it was, as we already know, fermented on a large scale. Every home had a barrel of sauerkraut, providing people with the necessary fiber and vitamins. during the months when fresh greens were unavailable. The secret to preserving all these vegetables was simple: the cellar. A good, deep, cold cellar was just as important as the barn. It maintained a stable low temperature, ideal for storing root vegetables. They were often sprinkled with sand or straw to prevent them from drying out and spoiling. These humble gifts of the earth were critical to balancing a heavy diet of salted meat and bread. They provided essential nutrients and fiber. Without turnips, onions, and cabbage, surviving the winter would have been immeasurably more difficult. Which of these vegetables would you be willing to eat all winter long? Vegetables are good, but what about spices? In the next chapter, we'll explore how spices changed everything. Contrary to popular belief, medieval cuisine, even in winter, was not completely bland. Spices and seasonings played a huge role in it, serving several functions at once. They were not only a status symbol, but also a way to make monotonous and salty food more palatable. Of course, exotic spices from the East, black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, were incredibly expensive. They were transported thousands of kilometers, and their price was comparable to gold. Only the wealthiest aristocrats could afford to season their food generously with them. For them, spices were a way to demonstrate their wealth and power. However, simpler but no less important local seasonings were available to the majority of the population. The most common and affordable hot seasoning was mustard. Mustard seeds were grown throughout Europe, ground into a paste, and mixed with water, ale, or vinegar. Mustard was excellent at masking the taste of salted meat. Another powerful local fire was horseradish. Its root was dug up in the fall and stored in cellars. Grated horseradish was served with meat, and its spiciness could liven up even the most boring dish. It was also valued for its supposed medicinal properties. In addition, dried herbs played a huge role. Every housewife would gather bunches of thyme, rosemary, sage, marjoram, and parsley in the summer. Once dried, they retained their aroma throughout the winter and were generously added to soups, sauces, and meat dishes. Sage, for example, was a classic accompaniment to fatty pork. Juniper berries gathered in the forest were also used. Their tart, pine-like aroma went well with game and was used in salting meat. They gave food a forest flavor and helped with preservation. Salt, although a preservative, also remained the main seasoning, but it was often mixed with other ingredients. For example, they made green salt, a mixture of salt and finely chopped dried herbs. It was an easy way to have a ready-made seasoning on hand. The main purpose of spices in winter was not so much to improve the taste as to mask it. Salted meat or fish that had been stored for several months could acquire unpleasant flavors. Spices, especially hot ones, helped to hide these flaws and make the food appetizing. It was true culinary alchemy. With mustard, horseradish, and a bunch of dried thyme, the cook transformed coarse, basic ingredients into something edible and even enjoyable. The psychological importance of this was enormous. Taste was one of the few pleasures available during the dark and cold months. Thus, the world of medieval spices was two-tiered. At the top were expensive imported peppers for kings, and at the bottom were mustard, horseradish, and herbs, which were accessible to everyone. But both served the same purpose: to make the winter diet tolerable and give it character. In cold climates, survival depends on calories. The energy needed to maintain body heat and perform hard work had to come from food. And the main source of concentrated energy in the medieval diet was fat. Fat consumption was not a luxury, but a harsh necessity. The main source of animal fat was pork. Pigs were profitable to keep because they were omnivorous. In the fall, after slaughter, the farm had a huge amount of lard at its disposal. It was melted down to produce smalts, or lard, which was poured into clay pots. This white, solidified fat was the main cooking fat throughout the winter. It was used for frying and added to soups and porridge for sustenance. A piece of bread spread with lard was a common, high-calorie meal. Salted lard was also an important part of the diet of soldiers and travelers. Dairy products were a problem in winter. Cows and goats produced very little milk during the cold season due to scarce feed. Fresh milk was a rarity. Therefore, the main emphasis was on processed dairy products that could be stored for a long time. The main one was cheese. In summer, when milk was in abundance, it was immediately used to make cheese. They mainly produced hard-aged cheeses that could be stored in cellars for months or even years. Cheese was a concentrated source of protein and fat. A head of hard cheese was as strategic a reserve as a sack of grain. It was nutritious and easy to transport. For a peasant, a piece of cheese with bread and onions was a full meal. Monasteries were famous for their cheese factories and often used cheese to pay for labor. Butter was also stored for future use. It was churned in the summer and then heavily salted to prevent spoilage. Salted butter was packed into wooden barrels and stored in the cold. It was used in cooking, but mainly in wealthy homes. The poor relied on cheaper lard. In addition to animal fats, vegetable oils were used on fasting days when animal products were forbidden. In Southern Europe, this was olive oil. In the North, people had to rely on more expensive oils from walnuts, flax, or hemp. This high-fat diet was perfectly suited to the conditions. It provided the fuel necessary for survival. A modern nutritionist would be horrified by such a diet, but for medieval people, it was the only way to stay warm and keep working. Thus, cheese and lard were the two pillars of winter calorie intake. They were compact, long-lasting, and incredibly energy-dense fuels that allowed the human body to function like a furnace in the most severe frosts. Cooking technology was as important as the food itself. In the Middle Ages, there was no kitchen as we understand it today. The hearth was its heart, a place where warmth, light, and the smell of cooking food came together. Especially in winter, family life revolved around it. Here they ate, warmed themselves, talked, and even slept when the cold crept into every crack. The hearth was a symbol of comfort and survival. Without it, the house seemed dead, for it was the hearth that provided the fire that saved them from hunger and cold. In the evenings, when the wind whistled outside and the walls hummed, the family gathered around the fire, listened to stories, mended clothes, and watched the soup slowly bubbling. In simple peasant houses, the hearth was an open pit or stone platform in the middle of the room. A cauldron hung above it on a chain, and the smoke went straight up through a hole in the roof. Because of this, the ceilings were black with soot and the air was thick, but people were used to it. The smoke repelled insects and even protected the wooden beams from rotting. Although it was inefficient from a heating point of view, such a hearth allowed for quick cooking over an open flame. There were benches around it, and there was always an armful of firewood and an iron poker nearby. Life was bustling here, and the fire never went out completely. The main item in the kitchen was a large iron cauldron. It was not just a utensil, but almost a member of the family. Soup was cooked in it, which rarely cooled down. It was eaten during the day, left on the coals at night, reheated in the morning, and new ingredients were added. This is how eternal soup was created, a continuous dish that fed the whole family. Everything that was at hand went into it. Vegetables, pieces of meat, cereals, leftover bread. Hot food was not a luxury, but a necessity. During the cold season, it warmed the body and helped people survive the long winter nights. In addition to cooking, the hearth was also used as an oven. Root vegetables, turnips, rutabagas, parsnips were cooked in hot ashes. They were simply buried and left for several hours. By morning, they became soft, sweet, and had a pleasant smoky taste. Sometimes housewives baked simple flatbread from barley or rye flour in the ashes, sometimes adding a little salt or honey. The smell of fresh flatbread, mixed with smoke and the aroma of vegetables, was one of the most familiar smells of a medieval home. It evoked warmth, security, and the labor of everyday life. In the homes of wealthier people, hearths gradually gave way to fireplaces. They were built into the walls and had a chimney, which made them much more efficient. Real kitchens with spits and metal grates were created around the fireplaces. This allowed new cooking methods to emerge, frying and baking. Chickens or pieces of beef were slowly rotated on spits, basting them with fat. However, such dishes were only available to the rich. Meat was expensive, and most of the population had to make do with vegetables and grains. Nevertheless, the aroma of roasted meat wafting through the castle was a sign of wealth and status.
How much longer for the oven, mistress?
Bread was considered the staple food in the Middle Ages, but not everyone had an oven. Building one was expensive and labor-intensive. It required a lot of clay, bricks, and firewood. Villages often had a communal oven that all residents used in turn. Each housewife came on the appointed day, brought her dough, and baked bread for her family for the week. This process turned into an event. Women socialized, shared news, and exchanged recipes. In cities, bakers flourished. Artisans, merchants, and even noblemen bought bread from them, preferring fresh baked goods baked in a hot stone oven. The tableware in a medieval home was extremely simple. The basis was clay pots, bowls, and jugs, which were used for storing and cooking food. Clay was cheap and accessible, so such vessels were often made by hand. Wooden spoons and bowls were used for eating, while metal utensils were rare and considered a luxury. Wealthy households could afford bronze or tin plates, but ordinary peasants ate directly from the pot or shared one bowl between two people. All that mattered was that the dishes could withstand the heat and not crack from the fire. The winter kitchen was a one-pot kitchen. Everything was saved: firewood, time, food. One fire was used both for cooking and for heating the room. Food was rarely cooked in portions. Everything was cooked together so that nothing would go to waste. Bones, bread scraps, vegetable peelings, everything was put to use.
Wow.
The food was hearty and warm, even if it was modest in taste. This method of cooking was not only practical, but also unifying. While the soup simmered in the cauldron, the family gathered around, talked, and shared a meal from one bowl, as their ancestors had done. Slow cooking had another important advantage. It made even the toughest food edible. Salted meat, dried fish, stale bread, all of this softened in the hot liquid. The taste of the dish was determined by what was on hand. Sometimes it was a rich meat broth, and sometimes just vegetable soup. But it was the combination of all the flavors mixed in one pot that created that special, homely atmosphere, without which it is impossible to imagine a medieval home. The hearth was the heart of the home in both the literal and figurative sense. It fed, warmed, and brought everyone together under one roof. Without it, life lost its rhythm, because the daily routine was built around the fire. In the morning, soup was cooked on it. During the day, food was reheated, and in the evening, the coals were extinguished, leaving a small amount of heat to prevent the house from cooling down. Food was stored in basements and cellars, and at the hearth, it was transformed into energy, warmth, and life itself. Medieval people depended on their fire as much as they did on air or water, and perhaps that is why the hearth was perceived as a sacred place, a source not only of food, but also of spiritual comfort. The hardest time of the year was not the middle of winter, but its end. This period, usually occurring in early spring, was called the Hungry Gap in England. It was a time when old supplies were running out and new ones had not yet arrived. By February and March, the barrels in the cellars were empty. The grain in the barns was running out, and it was strictly rationed until the new harvest. Salted meat and fish had been eaten or spoiled. It was the most vulnerable time of the year. Winter sucked the strength not only out of people, but also out of the earth. Nothing was growing yet. The first spring shoots were still far away. The cold could last a long time, and any prolonged spring became a serious test for the entire community. It was at this time that people turned to nature in search of any available food. Active gathering began. They looked for the first edible herbs that were breaking through the melting snow. Young nettles, wild garlic, ramson, dandelions. These first green shoots were invaluable. They were immediately added to soups. They were not so much a source of calories as a desperately needed source of fresh vitamins after a long winter on a canned diet. In the forest, they looked for tree roots and buds. It was meager food, but it allowed them to survive. In coastal areas, algae and shellfish were collected at low tide. Any available source of food was put to use. Interestingly, it was during this most difficult period that Lent most often took place. The church ban on meat, eggs, and dairy products coincided perfectly with their actual absence. Fasting was not only a spiritual practice, but also an ingenious mechanism for distributing resources. By prohibiting high-calorie animal products, fasting forced people to stretch their remaining supplies of grain and vegetables. It legalized and sanctified the need for economy. Thus, religious precepts and economic necessity went hand in hand. The appearance of the first fresh food was a real celebration. The first milk from a cow that had calved, the first eggs from hens that had begun to lay with the lengthening of daylight hours, the first fresh greens. All these were symbols of the end of a difficult period. The cycle of survival was coming to an end. A successful winter meant that the calculations were correct, the reserves were made correctly, and discipline was observed. The hunger gap was the last test that had to be passed before entering a new cycle of abundance and preparation for the next winter. We can see that the medieval winter diet was not about culinary delights, but about the pure science of survival. It was a system honed over centuries based on three pillars: preservation, calorie content, and patience. Salt, drying, pickling, and fat were the main tools in this struggle. From salted herring to liquid bread in the form of ale, from the ubiquitous turnip to life-saving sauerkraut, each product played an irreplaceable role. It was a diet born of harsh necessity, but it was this diet that allowed civilization to flourish in a less-than-friendly climate. These methods and products formed the basis of many European national cuisines. What was once a way to survive the winter has now become part of our cultural heritage. What other aspects of medieval life would you like us to explore? Perhaps you are interested in medicine, construction, or everyday clothing. Suggest topics for future videos in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the past.